Hello, I think this is on. Hey Facebook, this is Dr. Daniel Emina. I'm a general psychiatrist and a child and adolescent psychiatrist over here at Amen Clinic, Walnut Creek. Um, Hopefully some of my clients are watching now. Say hello to them, and any potential future clients, hello to you. And my other just Facebook family and friends. Hope this is informative for you guys. So, as many of you know, I'm a child psychiatrist, work with families quite a bit, work with adolescents quite a bit. And today's talk is actually going to be a little bit on teens and screens. All right, so that's actually becoming a hot topic recently because there's been a lot of research being published on how is all the screen time, how does that affect the brain? How does it affect development? How does it affect your child or your adolescent and actually even adults? Um, it's becoming more and more part of our lives, right? More and more studies show that the many of us that say they can't live without their phone during the day, we're often pulling it out to take a look at it quite often. And it does impact how we think, how we act, how we behave, and it potentially even impacts our relationships. Today will just be a 7, 8, 9 minute talk about some of the implications of this, specifically in adolescence. I'm actually giving a much longer talk on this in a few days over at USF, to be about an hour or so. We may put some information about that if you're in the area. It's through the Child and Family Developmental department over there. So, teens and screens. Why is this a big deal? Well, I'm going to start. I'm going to go back a bit. I want us to think about what's the brain trying to accomplish during development. And I actually use an analogy here because I actually like to speak in analogies because I think it helps us understand what the brain is doing. So if most of us have those phones, right? If you have one of those iPhones, you have an Android device, every year you notice that they'll release some new software, right? And you have to press the old upgrade button and get it upgraded. And the software may allow you to do something new and cool, potentially, hopefully. Or you may actually get a new device. Your device gets a little bit newer, fancier, does something different with the screen, the camera is a little different, and there's new software on it. If you're one of those people who had the old device and added the new software, sometimes you may find that, wow, it runs a little slower, it doesn't run quite the same anymore. So what's my example here trying to show? As we grow, as we age, our brain changes also, right? It's like getting new hardware all the time. So every time we get new hardware, our software needs should be catching up too. What I mean by that is our psychology, the way we're thinking. Right. I just see someone who's asking, and who's speaking? My name is Dr. Daniel Emina. I'm one of the general psychiatrists, child psychiatrists here over at the Amen Clinic, Walnut Creek. So again, here we're talking about teens and screens and the combination of the two and what that means. We're taking back a little bit again, like I said, to the developmental stages, what our brain is trying to accomplish during development. At each stage, our brain changes a bit, and our software should change with it. So in those first 2 decades of life, and actually first 3 decades of life, and even further, our brain's trying to accomplish quite a bit. It not only is it changing and growing and evolving and pruning, the software, our psychology is changing and growing. The first few years of life are about learning about ourselves. Especially, there's actually something called in the developmental stages, we go through a period where we have to figure out our level of identity. And that tends to happen during adolescence. So identity ends up being what we are, who we are, how we interact with those around us, how people see us, who we're going to be. This ends up setting the stage or foundation for what we're going to look like in some ways or interact like in our 20s, our 30s, and 40s. And if we struggle here, this can set a bad tone for life. And it can impact life in a negative way. So this is where traumas and things that occur become more problematic, or things like untreated ADHD become more problematic. So how does this relate to screens? Well, screens give a greater level of access to the outside world than we've ever had before. For most teens before, the way to define identity was how you interacted with your friends. And then when the big identity push was getting that car, getting that access, that driver's license, it started to show that you're differentiated more and more from your parents now. But you know what's happened now? Kids don't care about that as much. They can get Uber or something. Right? The way they now start to differentiate more and create an identity for themselves is actually on that app. It's Instagrams, it's their Facebooks, it's the other stuff that we don't even know that they're using yet, right? That's a new form of identity, and it's also a new form of feedback. But as many of you have probably learned, the internet's not the nicest place. It's actually become kind of mean at times. And imagine a developing brain getting significant amount of feedback or developing their sense of self on a device. When the most recent stats, kids can be on devices 6 to 9 hours a day. It ends up becoming a significant point of influence separate from their parents, separate from their teachers, even potentially even separate from their friends that they interact with often. That means they can have influence on who they feel they are, and it can impact their moods, and it can impact how they act and how they behave. So more recently, they've been doing some studies, and they found that the more time you spend on a screen, the increased risk of depression and anxiety. Interestingly enough, it's not as simple as a one-to-one, cause and effect, right? Just because you're on a screen doesn't mean you're going to get depressed, right? It does mean you may not do the other things that keep you healthy. It may impact your sleep. It may impact your exercise routine. It may impact your one-on-one connections, which are important to keeping you well. It may even change the food you eat, right? You may see things there and you may not eat as healthy. And you may also get significant negative feedback, right? You may define yourself by the amount of likes you get on an app. That starts to impact who you are and how you feel you do, or how well you do. And you may get feedback from people who actually don't care the same way a friend would care, or a parent or family member would care. And again, like I said, if you spend 6 to 9 hours on there, that's potentially a lot of feedback. So in more recent years, there's been increased depression, increased anxiety, actually significantly increased versus in 10, 20, 30 years ago, with increased risk for suicidality, depression overall. So very, very concerning stats, and it's actually why I'm going to be speaking about this in a few days. So what do we do about this? If we know this period of development is extremely important, then we need to honor this period of development, right? Just the same way as we tell kids don't do drugs, don't get into alcohol, don't get into those things because it affects you, how your brain is developing. Spending that much time on the screen and getting that level of influence externally actually also affects how your brain develops, how you end up feeling, how you end up thinking about yourself. So here's what I usually tell parents, and even the adolescents that are self-aware a bit. If you find that you're spending enough time or excessive amount of time on there that it's starting to impact on what you do in other aspects of life, it may be time to start looking at cutting back a bit. If you're losing track of time, you're becoming defensive about it, you prefer to spend more time on that screen than hanging out with the friend or the family, that may be a sign that something's going on. If you're becoming more socially isolated, there's actually a moodiness that goes with it now. There's more irritable. You have more online friends than in-person friends. If you're actually now starting to fall back in your level of function, so you're not doing your schoolwork, the grades are falling off, right? You're not getting the tasks done in the home. That's a problem. If you're not just starting to hide the screen, you're like using the screen everywhere you're going and put it under the table, right? It may start to become a problem. If you realize that when you don't have that screen with you, your anxiety level goes up a little bit, it may also start to become a problem. So what do we do about this? Well, like everything else, they can be too much of a good thing, right? Screens aren't inherently bad. They have increased our access to knowledge, Net effect of screens is probably a more connected world, and it's allowed for overall advancement of children, adults, our society. But we need to be responsible with it. So, as parents, as teachers, we need to teach teens, our adolescents, the kids, even younger, because I've seen some 6, 7 year olds already starting to get phones already. We need to be more cognizant of their time on that phone. But before we start actually giving them phones, we need to be intentional with how that looks. We need to create routines around that phone. We need to have a contract related to that phone or that screen, whether it's an iPad or whatever it may be, right? Initially, really, you need to build a relationship with your child. If you're able to build a relationship with your child, be not only their parent, but and again, parent first. Your job is not necessarily to be the friend. It's more to be a parent. But if you're able to build a relationship, you are able to more likely guide them without them feeling controlled by you. Pay attention. Just be aware of how much they're using it. We as parents, or we as adults, we can get distracted too in our own lives, and we can be on our own devices. Are we overusing it? Are we setting a poor model for them? Establish boundaries around it. For the most part, I don't think adolescents should be able to keep a phone past 9 or 10, maybe even earlier. They should be turning it in and plugging it in somewhere else. It affects their sleep. Kids start getting diagnosed with ADD when it's just really they're staying up too late and not sleeping quite enough. So setting and establishing consistent boundaries related to the use of that device, whether it's a phone, whether it's an iPad, whatever it may be. Start talking about this very early with your kids. And then know your child. So this is important. I have some families where they can create routines around screen and it works. And some families, they have to go zero screen, because if their child gets screen access, it's dangerous in some ways. The child gets more irritable, more anxious, more over-focused. It can actually make the ADD symptoms worse for some. So keep that in mind too. Each brain is a little bit different. And the main thing, if you start to notice that it is becoming problematic, your child is getting to a point where they can no longer manage it, start looking to get some help. Talk to the teachers, talk to a therapist, talk to other parents who may have dealt with similar situations, start reading up online about this a bit. Screens aren't inherently bad, but they need to be respected and treated appropriately. Just as you may remember when you got your first driver's license, there was boundaries and rules about how to use it. For the most part, most parents didn't say, here's your driver's license, here's your car, drive whenever you want to, go wherever you want to. But with screen access and internet access now, if your child has a phone at midnight, it's like being able to drive and go wherever they want to at midnight. And you may not want that. You may not want that at 2 a.m. in the morning. So consider that also. A lot more to discuss on this topic. We'll have more of these discussions. If there are questions that come up, there's some things you can write up in the comments there. We can do our best to try to answer those. But this is a big issue. It was great getting a chance to chat with you guys. Again, we'll be doing a talk in San Francisco if you happen to be around. Teens and Screens. It's be much longer, a little bit more in-depth, more detail on this. It's December 5th at 6 p.m. at USF, okay? All right, guys. It was a pleasure talking with you all. Take care.